Now to Brazil, where the Supreme Court has found the country's far-right former president, Jair Bolsonaro, guilty of plotting a coup to stay in power following his election defeat in 2022. The 70-year-old now faces the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars after being sentenced to 27 years in prison. Mr. Bolsonaro denies the allegations and says he will appeal. However, experts say it's unlikely the verdict will change.
The trial at the Supreme Court in Brasilia was unprecedented. Never before had a former Brazilian head of state been charged with plotting a coup. 4 of the 5 presiding judges voted to convict Jair Bolsonaro, seen here in file footage. Carmen Lucia became the 3rd judge to convict Bolsonaro, sealing his fate.
I have it confirmed by the Office of the Prosecutor General that Jair Messias Bolsonaro committed the crimes attributed to him as the leader of the criminal organization.
Bolsonaro's son claims his father is not well enough to survive decades in prison.
Unfortunately, Jair Bolsonaro's health is fragile. Doctors say so. And we hope that this persecution ends, which is why we keep putting pressure on from abroad, because this is indeed a case of human rights violations.
Some celebrated the conviction.
He should have been tried a long time ago. Brazil is proportionally the country that lost the most people in the pandemic due to incompetence, because the far right is a vehicle for the destruction of the country. Everything is destroyed: healthcare, science, technology, education, culture. Everything is destroyed.
Others remain unhappy. Tens of thousands of his supporters have rallied in cities across the country in recent days, many agreeing with US President Trump that the trial is a witch hunt. They reject all allegations against Bolsonaro. It was Bolsonaro's failed attempt to stage a coup that led to his downfall. On January the 8th, 2023, hundreds of Bolsonaro's supporters launched what was called the worst attack on the country's federal institutions since the return to democracy in the 1980s following 2 decades of military rule. In an echo of what had happened in the US under Trump 2 years before, rioters stormed the Supreme Court, the presidential palace and Congress, calling for new elections and urging the military to oust Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the newly elected left-wing president. Bolsonaro's supporters, including his son and lawmaker Flavio, says there is no evidence tying him to a coup. But others say the only reason it did not succeed was because Bolsonaro failed to gain the military support.
Let's get more on this from journalist Júlia Carneiro. She joins us from Rio. Welcome to DW. How are people reacting to this verdict?
Well, the country is very divided, Phil. Bolsonaro has very loyal supporters, as we saw in those pictures there, but many people here are celebrating. He was a very controversial president in Brazil, a divisive far-right leader, and the extent of the events that we saw, the riots in Brasilia in January of 2023, the idea that Brazil's democracy was threatened again of a coup, just 40 years after the end of a 2-decade-long dictatorship. This was really outraging Brazilians, and the fact that the Supreme Court has now ruled to punish him for the first time for an act like that in Brazilian history,
right.
is leading lots of people to celebrate.
And the Bolsonaro team say they're going to appeal. This judgment came from the Supreme Court, so who would hear an appeal?
There are procedural mechanisms to appeal, and Bolsonaro will probably only go to prison once these appeals are over, which, according to courts today, it's estimated that that could happen by December. His lawyers have considered the sentence excessive and disproportionate, and as well as an appeal. We have to consider as well that Brazilian politics has many twists and turns. So there's mobilization in Congress for an amnesty law to be voted. These protests that we've seen on the streets in the past days of Bolsonaro supporters do call for this amnesty to be voted. And Bolsonaro and his camp, they hope that they can also influence the elections for next year if a president is elected as an ally. If Bolsonaro manages to make his successor, it could be that a future president on the right could also pardon him. So this sentence is valid for now, but we'll have to see what happens.
Let's look at that prospect then, because Mr. Bolsonaro, his appeal was beyond his own particular party. He had this Bolsonarismo movement. So who is there? Is there someone waiting in the wings to take over the leadership of that movement if he does end up being in prison for decades?
Yes, there are strong names in the Bolsonarismo movement. Two of them are the governors of São Paulo and the governor of Minas Gerais states, two very important states in Brazil that have come forward as one of them as officially as a pre-candidate for the 2026 elections. Bolsonaro's sons could also be considered, but they're seen as too radical to take on this role and to appease Brazil's population.
Right. And a quick word then about the president who did not get deposed. Where does this verdict leave President Lula's government in such a deeply polarized country?
President Lula is really hated by Bolsonaro supporters, by Bolsonaro himself. He was always strongly criticized by Bolsonaro, but his current government, his approval rates aren't doing great. And ironically, what happened now with this trial straining U.S. and Brazil relations, with President Donald Trump jumping in and imposing really harsh sanctions on Brazil, really heavy tariffs, 50% tariffs over Brazilian goods because of the trial. This is actually benefiting Lula's image because he's capitalizing on the rhetoric of Brazilian sovereignty and having to defend Brazilian sovereignty and calling for the defense of democracy as well. And he's looking at 2026.
Thank you so much for guiding us through that, Julia. Journalist Júlia Carneiro in Rio de Janeiro.
Well, joining me here in the studio now is Albert Steinberger. He is from our Brazil service. Albert, it's good to have you in the studio. I understand that the attorneys for Bolsonaro have said that he plans to appeal. So what are the grounds going to be for this appeal?
Well, they have many. I mean, the defense always make the point that Bolsonaro shouldn't be being judged inside of the Supreme Court. It should go to a normal judge, since he's not anymore the president. The other ground is that it was not a fair trial, and for sure one of the twists of this trial was the vote of Justice Fuchs that actually disagreed of the colleagues and said Bolsonaro was not guilty. So this might open a lot of possibilities for other kinds of appeals.
Well, help us understand this, Albert. Bolsonaro is a former president, and he's saying that he shouldn't have justice delivered at the Supreme Court. Why not? I mean, on the outside, we would assume that the Supreme Court would be the court for a former president to have his case heard.
Absolutely, but the point of the defense is that actually the Supreme Court was directly involved and they wouldn't be impartial enough, but also that he was not the president when they pressed charges, so it should go to a judge. This also happened with the case of Lula, which was quite a different of Lula da Silva. But this is quite, it's hard to make parallels because the case of Lula started already with a normal judge, and then it's just different.
I know that this trial has polarized a lot of people in Brazil, many saying that this has been seen as a referendum on democracy. Why is that?
Well, if you ask a Bolsonaro supporter, he would say that actually Brazil is already under a dictatorship of the Supreme Court. But we need to see, I think, this, especially because it's so polarized, from a historical perspective. I mean, Brazil had 9 coups d'etat since his independence. So it's like, this is a very unusual moment to judge Bolsonaro the way it was judged, to judge a president because of an attempt of coup d'etat might be also a good learning for future presidents, and especially in a continent that you have this culture of military also always getting involved into politics.
And what does the future of this populist right-wing movement look like now that you've got Bolsonaro heading to prison?
Well, you cannot declare Bolsonaro dead. This is very important. I mean, there is this movement also inside of the parliament gaining traction right now, that is to try to make a pardon, an amnesty, a bill to make a wide amnesty. The question is right now if it would include Bolsonaro or just the people who were found guilty by storming the public buildings in the 8th of January in Brazil. So this is the main question right now inside of the parliament. But you do have one big name that emerges on this. This is the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas. He goes very well on the polls right now. We cannot forget that we have a Brazilian election, presidential election next year, and he's the strongest name by now to run for president. So he would be the natural name. But at the same time, you have a lot of, inside Bolsonaro family, you have a lot of movement to try to inherit the father's political legacy, so to say.
Bolsonaro, I know he had strong support, or has strong support, from U.S. President Donald Trump. You and I were talking about this earlier. Trump has called this trial a witch hunt. This trial did not turn out the way Trump was hoping, obviously.
Not at all. But also, when Trump started to meddle and to try to impose tariffs, or he did impose tariffs and sanctions against the Brazilian justices, he actually brought the justice system of Brazil even closer to protect themselves from an alien interference, so to say. So I think this is, and you had many references during this trial of the U.S. attempt to meddle on this, and even making jokes about it, and saying that Brazil would not be a colony, this time not from Portugal, but from the U.S.
Yeah, fascinating. Albert Steinberger, Albert, good to have you in the studio. Good to get your perspective on this. Thank you.
Thank you.